My name is Sylvia Salmon and I am 17 years old. I was supposed to be counting down to the best summer of my life, the kind people talk about years later. With a smile they can't quite hide because in 2 months I was meant to step onto a college campus I had dreamed about for as long as I could remember. A place known for its microbiology program, a place that felt like proof that every quiet night spent studying alone had meant something. When my acceptance email arrived a month earlier, I reread it so many times my eyes hurt, my hands trembling as if the words might disappear if I blinked too hard. I didn't scream or jump around the room. I just sat on my bed, holding my phone against my chest, letting the relief wash over me. For once, I had done something purely for myself, and I believed naively, as it turned out, that my parents would support me at least in the one way they always had financially. They had told me to apply anywhere I wanted. Those words replayed in my head again and again, especially later when everything began to unravel. My father is a software engineer. My mother, the head of sales at her company, and we live comfortably enough that money has never been a daily worry. We weren't extravagant, but we were secure. No siblings, no emergencies draining our savings, just 3 people under one roof, existing alongside one another more than together. So when they sat me down at the kitchen table one evening, their faces tight in that careful way adults use when they think they're being responsible, I wasn't prepared for what they said next. They told me they couldn't afford my dream college. At first I laughed, thinking it was some kind of joke, a poorly delivered attempt at testing my reaction. But my mother didn't smile, and my father didn't look up from the papers he had neatly arranged in front of him, as if this were a business meeting instead of a conversation about my future. They said I should go to my safety school instead, the one closer to home, the one that cost significantly less. They talked about retirement, about savings, about how tuition would wipe them out. I remember staring at them genuinely confused, because the numbers didn't add up. Even at 17, I knew that. They were in their early 40s, not even halfway through their careers, and suddenly they were acting like paying for my education would leave them destitute. I argued, "Of course I did," at first calmly explaining that they had encouraged me to aim high, that the tuition was well within their means. When that didn't work, I begged, my voice cracking as I reminded them how hard I had worked, how this program aligned perfectly with what I wanted to do. I even bargained, offering to pay them back in full once I had a job, promising I wouldn't let them suffer for my choices. My words seemed to bounce off them unheard. My father suggested student loans with an almost dismissive shrug, as if debt were some minor inconvenience instead of a weight that could shape the rest of my life. My mother nodded along, already mentally moving on, as if the decision had been made long before this conversation ever happened. After a week of fighting, I realized there was no point. They weren't changing their minds. The choice they presented me with felt cruel in its simplicity. Give up on my dream or take on a mountain of debt at 18. Both options left me hollow. I started researching loans late into the night, scrolling through terms and conditions until the words blurred together, applying for scholarships with a desperation that surprised even me. What I stopped doing was talking to my parents. The anger sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and unmoving, and I didn't know how to speak to them without letting it spill out in ways I couldn't take back. The truth is, our relationship had always been strained. My parents worked constantly, the kind of people who brought their jobs home with them, their minds always elsewhere. When I was younger, it was my grandparents who took care of me, filling the spaces my parents left empty with warmth and attention. Once I was old enough to stay home alone, I became invisible. They would leave for hours, come back exhausted. Ask me about school, out of obligation rather than interest. I learned early not to expect much. I stopped trying to share my thoughts, my fears, my small victories because it felt pointless. They provided a roof, clothes, food, tuition for a decent school. Emotionally, though, they were distant like landlords rather than parents. I'm aware of how harsh that sounds. I've been told it makes me seem ungrateful, spoiled, selfish. But when you grow up craving attention and never quite receiving it, you learn to redefine relationships in ways that protect you from disappointment. I didn't expect affection or praise. I didn't need them to tell me they were proud. I just believed, perhaps foolishly, that when it came to education, the one area where they had never let me down, they would come through. That belief shattered the moment they told me I wasn't worth the investment. What hurt most wasn't just the refusal, it was the ease with which they dismissed my pain, the way they framed their decision as logical and responsible as if my dreams were an unreasonable expense rather than the culmination of years of effort. Something in me broke then, quietly. I stopped seeing them as parents I could rely on and started seeing them as obstacles I had to work around. I didn't know yet that this was only the beginning, that there was a deeper betrayal waiting just beneath the surface, one that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. At that moment, though, all I felt was loss of trust, of certainty, of the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they would choose me when it mattered most. The day I found out the truth wasn't dramatic at first. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no sudden realization that made the room spin. It arrived quietly disguised as a message from a friend who had no idea she was about to shatter what little stability I had left. She sent me a screenshot with a short caption of her own, something lighthearted, about how lucky my cousin was to have such generous relatives. I stared at the image for a long time before it fully registered. My parents were in the photo, standing on either side of my cousin, their arms wrapped around him, their smiles wide and unguarded, in a way I couldn't remember ever seeing directed at me. Beneath it was his caption, thanking them for sponsoring his education and encouraging him to chase his dreams. I felt like the ground had dropped out from under me. At first, I thought there had to be some mistake. Maybe it was old. Maybe it was exaggerated. Maybe sponsor didn't mean what I thought it did. But the more I looked, the more it made sense in a way that made my chest ache. My cousin was the same age as me. He was starting college at the same time. And from what I could tell, the school he was going to attend cost more than mine. The lies my parents had fed me about not having enough money replayed in my mind, each one turning sour as the truth settled in. They hadn't been unable to help me. They had chosen not to. What made it worse was the realization that they had tried to hide it. I couldn't even see my cousin's profile anymore. Either he had blocked me or my parents had asked him to. The secrecy felt intentional, calculated, as if they knew exactly how hurtful this would be, and decided it was easier to keep me in the dark. My friend, blissfully unaware, went on about how kind my parents were, how lucky my cousin must feel. I didn't reply. I couldn't. My hands were shaking too much to type. Logic tried to intrude, but it only made things worse. My cousin's grades weren't better than mine. His father, my uncle, worked as a teacher at a private school and earned enough to live comfortably. They had a decent house, nice things, nothing that suggested they were struggling. His mother wasn't in the picture anymore, but she was a journalist and still involved in his life. None of it added up. The only conclusion that made sense was the one I didn't want to accept. My parents had decided his dreams mattered more than mine. They weren't home when I found out. They rarely were. I paced the house, anger building, with every step rehearsing confrontations that grew more explosive by the minute. I imagined demanding answers, watching them scramble for excuses. But something stopped me. A small, tired part of me knew exactly how that conversation would go. Calm voices, rational explanations, my feelings dismissed as overreactions. I couldn't bear it. Instead, I grabbed my bag and left, heading somewhere that had always felt safer, even if I hadn't been there in months. My grandparents' house smelled the same as it always had, faintly of tea and old books. When they opened the door and saw me, their faces lit up with genuine warmth, the kind that made my throat tighten instantly. They told me how much they'd missed me, how happy they were to see me, and I felt a sharp pang of guilt for staying away so long. I had pulled back because my grandmother had been sick, diagnosed with Parkinson's a year earlier, and I hadn't wanted to burden them with my problems. Standing there now, though, I realized how much I had missed this feeling of being truly welcomed. I didn't waste time. The words poured out of me, messy and emotional, my voice breaking as I told them everything. My parents' refusal. The arguments, the lies, the photo. I cried harder than I had in years. All the frustration and hurt spilling over at once. My grandparents listened in silence, their expressions growing more severe with every detail. When I finally ran out of words, they didn't scold me or tell me to calm down. They hugged me, holding me, as if they were trying to shield me from years of disappointment all at once. Then they told me to go home, pack my things, and come back to live with them. I stared at them stunned. Part of me felt relief so intense it was almost painful. Another part felt fear. I asked what they meant, how long they expected me to stay, what my parents would say. They waved off my questions gently and told me not to worry. My education, they said, would be taken care of. I wouldn't have to give up my college. I wouldn't have to take out loans if I didn't want to. The certainty in their voices left no room for doubt. I worried about their finances, about hospital bills and retirement, and everything my parents had drilled into me about being careful with money. I offered to work to pay part of it myself to find some compromise. They laughed softly and told me they had more than enough, that this was not a sacrifice, but a choice. I didn't ask how. I was too overwhelmed, too relieved, and maybe too afraid of what the answer might imply. When I went back to my parents' house to pack, the silence felt heavier than ever. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, gathering clothes and books, leaving behind a place that had never truly felt like home. I expected a call that evening, some sign that they had noticed I was gone, that they cared. Instead, my phone buzzed with a text. Hours later, the words cold and sharp telling me how disappointed they were in me, how they never wanted to see me again. I read it over and over, my heart sinking as I realized that even now, even after everything, they weren't worried about where I was or whether I was safe. They were angry, furious even, not because they had hurt me, but because I had dared to expose the truth. And in that moment, I understood that leaving hadn't just been an act of defiance. It had been the first step towards something far more dangerous, a complete and irreversible break. I didn't respond to my parents' text right away. I stared at it for a long time, my phone heavy in my hand, my emotions tangled in a way I couldn't sort through. I had expected anger when they realized I was gone, maybe even panic. What I hadn't expected was rejection so immediate and so complete, as if my absence was an inconvenience rather than a cause for concern. Still, as the night wore on and my grandparents moved quietly around the house giving me space, another message came through. This one was longer. This one was meant to explain everything. According to them, my uncle had lost his teaching job a few weeks earlier. They didn't say how only that it was serious enough to get him fired. His ex-wife, who was getting remarried, soon had apparently refused to contribute to their son's tuition. My cousin, faced with the possibility of giving up his dream college, had reacted dramatically, threatening to run away, accusing everyone of ruining his life. My parents painted it as a crisis, one that demanded immediate action. They said they had stepped in because he needed them more than I did, because I could manage with loans, scholarships, or compromises while he couldn't. Reading those words made something twist painfully inside me. I understood concern. I even understood panic. What I couldn't understand was how easily they had decided that I would bear the cost of their compassion for someone else. They admitted that paying for my cousin's degree, especially since he planned to major in art, was a risk one my uncle couldn't afford to take. That was exactly why my father thought it made sense for them to handle it instead. In his mind, it was logical, necessary, almost noble. In that same breath, he reduced my dreams to something optional, something I could postpone or sacrifice without lasting damage. The last part of the message hit hardest. Earlier that day, my grandparents had called my parents and informed them that they were being cut out of the will. Everything would go to me instead. That was why my parents were furious. Not because I had been hurt, not because our relationship was crumbling, but because there were financial consequences they hadn't anticipated. They accused me of running to my grandparents instead of talking to them first, of turning the family against them. They made it sound as though I had orchestrated the entire thing, as if I had planned to take everything from them out of spite. I didn't reply. I didn't know how to. What could I say that wouldn't sound defensive or cruel? I could see their point in a way. Maybe I should have confronted them directly instead of leaving. Maybe involving my grandparents had escalated things. But another part of me, the part that still felt like a scared child begging to be seen, knew that if I hadn't gone to my grandparents, nothing would have changed. The lies would have continued. I would have been expected to quietly accept less, as I always had. Days passed, a week, then another. No calls, no messages. The silence was suffocating even as life with my grandparents settled into a gentler rhythm. They cooked for me, asked about my classes, listened when I talked. It was peaceful in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. Yet guilt lingered. I kept thinking about the inheritance, about how much money that must represent, about whether I deserved it. I didn't need all of it. I knew that. My parents and uncle would likely need it someday. The thought that I might be depriving them of that future weighed heavily on me. I wondered if I was being cruel, if I had allowed my anger to dictate everything. My cousin could have taken out loans too, just like I was expected to. Why was his distress more urgent than mine? Why was I expected to be mature and understanding while he was allowed to threaten to run away and be rewarded for it? The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't about practicality at all. It was about patterns, about who was expected to endure disappointment quietly and who was protected at all costs. Eventually, I told my grandparents about the text. I expected them to hesitate to reconsider. Instead, they were indignant. They said it was absurd for my parents to believe I should have been okay with being pushed aside no matter the circumstances. If my uncle needed help, they argued he should have come to his parents, not relied on his brother to sacrifice his own child's future. They spoke about pride and ego, about how my father and uncle had always refused help, even when it made no sense, even when it hurt the people around them. Hearing that gave me some clarity, but it didn't erase the knot in my chest. 2 weeks after I moved out, when I was just beginning to feel like I could breathe again, my parents showed up at my grandparents' door. And the moment I saw them standing there, I knew that whatever happened next would decide everything. I knew it was them before I even opened the door. There was a certain tension in the air, a heaviness that reminded me too much of the nights I spent waiting for them to come home from work, listening for footsteps that never seemed eager to reach me. When my grandfather opened the door and stepped aside, I saw my parents standing there, faces tight with anger and resolve as if they had come prepared for a battle rather than a conversation. My mother's eyes flicked to me, searching my face for something I didn't know how to give her anymore. My father didn't look at me at all. They didn't ask how I was. They didn't ask if I was safe. My father went straight to the point, telling me to pack my things and come home with them. He spoke as if this were a temporary misunderstanding that could be corrected with authority. I said no, without hesitation. The word came out stronger than I expected, and for a moment the room was silent. Then my mother's voice cracked as she said I was being unreasonable, that I didn't understand how complicated things had become. My father's jaw clenched, and he said if I didn't cooperate, they would call the police and accuse my grandparents of abducting me. Something inside me snapped. All the anger I had swallowed for years surged forward, hot and uncontrollable. I screamed at them, my voice echoing through the house, accusing them of neglecting me, my entire childhood of choosing their own comfort and pride over being present, of putting my cousin ahead of me as if I were disposable. I told them how it felt to grow up invisible, to be treated like an obligation rather than a daughter, and how this was just the final proof that I had never been their priority. Words poured out of me faster than I could think, years of bitterness and pain finally finding release. I felt lighter even as my hands shook, as if something toxic had finally been expelled from my body. My mother started crying quiet sobs that might have moved me once. This time, they didn't. My father waited until I stopped yelling, his expression cold and disappointed. He told me he was ashamed of the way I had turned out, that he wished he hadn't bothered coming to fix things. When I demanded to know what he meant, he explained calmly that he had planned to introduce me to a friend at a bank who could help me secure a loan more easily. He said it like it was a generous offer, like it should make everything better. I felt my rage spike again. That was his solution. Not an apology, not accountability, just another way to avoid giving me what they could have given me all along. I wanted to scream, to throw them out myself, but my grandparents stepped in before I could. They told my parents to leave and not come back, reminding them that in a few weeks I would be 18 and legally free to live wherever I chose. Even if I weren't, they said they would rather face consequences than send me back into a home that had already done so much damage. My parents left my mother still crying, my father silent and rigid. The door closed behind them with a finality that made my chest ache even as relief washed over me. To make sure there could be no more threats, my grandparents contacted an attorney to protect themselves and me. They apologized to me for not intervening when I was younger, for not taking me away from my parents when they saw how distant they were. I told them it wasn't their fault. Some truths reveal themselves only when it's already too late. I won't say I was surprised by how things ended. Disappointed, yes, but not surprised. This was always where we were headed. My parents had let me down in small ways for years. This time I refused to let them do it again. Walking away wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I needed to be free of the constant disappointment of hoping they would change. A few weeks later, I attended my first day of college. I sat in a lecture hall, surrounded by strangers, who would soon become friends, feeling a cautious excitement bloom in my chest. My parents weren't there. They weren't calling or texting. Instead, my grandparents were waiting for me at home, proud and smiling, asking me how my day had gone. For the first time, I felt supported without conditions, loved without needing to earn it. My family looks different now, smaller, quieter, but it's real. And as I move forward, I carry both the grief of what I never had and the gratitude for what I finally do. I don't know what the future holds, but for the first time in my life, it feels like it belongs to me.